Hello changemakers, welcome back. My name is Cameron Davis. For those who are new to the channel, Cammy D, don't call me Cammy. Hello changemakers, I hope you all are doing well, staying safe during this pandemic. When you're watching this, where you're watching this, doesn't matter. I just hope that you guys are all staying well, staying safe, and staying positive. Today I'm going to be answering a question that appeared in the comments of the last conversation video. So this is the question. I like this question a lot because it's a pretty deep question and it allowed me to explore topics that I didn't really know before. The main component is apartheid, and I didn't know what that meant until I researched it. So that's a good lesson to research stuff, because as I researched it, I realized it was easier than I thought it would be. In order to answer this question, I realized we had to split it up into many different parts. We had to break down the question in order to understand it, in order to give a clear explanation and an answer to what I was doing with the research and how I could educate you guys. So I tried to make it as smooth as possible. The first thing that we're gonna try and learn is, what is apartheid? Second, how did it happen? Third, how was it enforced? So how was apartheid enforced? Fourth, what was the result of apartheid? And 5, how did it end? So hope you guys are interested. You guys can stick with me. Subscribe so you don't miss another Cam's conversation video, gaming content, vlog content, anything. This channel is generic. So if you're excited like I am to dive into this conversation. So what is apartheid? Apartheid was started in 1940 in South Africa, and what apartheid is, breaking down the word, it's basically a system of legislation enforcing division or separation or segregation in South Africa between whites and non-whites. So if we break down the word of apartheid, we could understand that it means apart, and that's the way I see it, and we could use that to then define what happened in South Africa. It was the division between whites and non-whites. Whether it was through different churches, different schools, different ways in teaching the education that they were learning. There was a lot of things that apartheid did in South Africa that imposed as negatives to non-whites because they were not getting the resources and the tools that they needed to prosper in that time. To fully understand the grasp of how a white minority came into power, you have to understand that Africa is a continent, and that continent was a source of wealth for Western civilizations, which means that colonizers and people who are from Europe or wanted to colonize countries for wealth would kind of go to Africa, and specifically South Africa. And when South Africa became a British colony in 1806, it led downhill from there. So as we fast forward to 1948, the South African government was now white people in power. And this led to the idea of apartheid being enforced, and it being enforced heavily. What I mean by this is that there were different churches for whites and non-whites, different schools, different things you were taught in the education system. There was a lot of division. And they went to great lengths to keep this division. During apartheid in South Africa, if you were over the age of 16, you had to carry something called a passbook. Passbooks basically showed who you were, where you live, where you worked if you had a job, any information on you. And if you didn't have your passbook on you and you were over 16, you would be thrown into prison. So what I want to talk to you about now is people in power and how they influence change. There was a guy named Hendrik Verwoerd. He was the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, from 1958 to 1966. He was assassinated in 66. But throughout the years he was Prime Minister, he was enforcing legislation that upheld apartheid. One thing that he passed was the promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which sounds great, right? But in reality, it forced blacks into settlements in 8 separate reservations, or Bantu homelands, later called the Bantustans or Black States. Top of that, there was something called the Bantu Education Act. It was passed in 1953, and which ensured that blacks were not getting the same education as whites, and the education that they were getting was only going to allow them to work in the working class in the future. The laws that Hendrik Verwoerd upheld during his reign of power were used to discriminate, used to misinform, and it was used to make it socially impossible for blacks to get into positions of power. It was made so that blacks couldn't get into a higher socioeconomic status. I know you asked the question, did any black South Africans fight back? Or did they ever protest, or couldn't they do anything to try and make change? And the answer is yes, they did. But the government did everything that they could to stop the momentum, to make sure that change wasn't going to happen, to make sure to hold their stance on apartheid. An example I can give is March 1960, Sharpeville. What happened then was over 5,000 black South Africans were protesting having to carry passbooks in South Africa. And this event led to a massacre. The government had armed militia, they had weapons, and they had more weapons than the protesters because it was a peaceful protest. While they were walking to the police station and protesting this unjust rule or legislation, this protest turned into a massacre. Over 67 to 69 blacks were killed, murdered, and 180 to 400 blacks were injured. What didn't help was South Africa stopped being part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is basically a group of colonies that hold the British monarch as the head of the association, which is problematic because that's what happened to South Africa, which shouldn't really be imposed or enforced onto them. But it is what happened, and that's a conversation for another day. Basically, with leaving the Commonwealth, and Canada is a part of the Commonwealth, it's one of the British colonies, and we approved the British monarch as our head. With leaving the Commonwealth, Hendrik basically had the power to become more of a republic country. This meant that Hendrik's dream of a republic became true in May 31st, 1961. We have to acknowledge that even though they left the Commonwealth and even though they tried protesting before, black South Africans still continued to fight. In 1976, thousands of black children in Soweto demonstrated against the Afrikaans language. The Afrikaans language is basically the language that white people spoke in South Africa at the time. So they protested that they had to speak the Afrikaans language for black African students. The law meant that African children wouldn't be allowed to use or learn their native tongue. And at the protest, police opened fire with tear gas, with guns, and they killed up to 700 people. And 4,000 people were injured. So, with the combination of protests and with the combination of governments being horrible, it led to an economic sanction. And economic recession. Economic recession means money go bye-bye. Means the money or the funding that they're getting from other communities, which would be getting from the Commonwealth, but from other communities or other nations or trades, started to reduce. This also meant that it drew more national attention to South Africa. It shattered the illusion that apartheid had brought peace and justice to South Africa, and now the media was starting to get more coverage on what was actually happening. Not just in the media, but other countries as well. So, as the world was slowly starting to take notice, in 1973, the United Nations General Assembly pointed out that apartheid was bad. They basically denounced it. Basically meaning that they said, apartheid's bad, stop, please don't do it. In 1976, the UN Security Council voted to impose a mandatory embargo on the sales of weapons to South Africa. This affected South Africa a lot because they were at war. And finally, in 1985, the United Kingdom and the United States both imposed economic sanctions. They basically started campaigns to stop trades with South Africa, and because they didn't want any affiliation with apartheid, and they didn't want any affiliation with this horrible, this ruthless form of legislation. And even though it's not that easy. That's the problem. Yes, they started campaigns to stop it, but not everyone was on board. In the 1980s, the US President Ronald Reagan and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher both thought that Nelson Mandela, we'll talk about him later, and the African National Congress, the ANC, were communists and terrorists. These two, the President and the Prime Minister, both went as far as to veto the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. But the United States Congress overrode the decision with 2/3 majority passing the act. So even though the President wasn't on board and the Prime Minister wasn't on board, it still ended up happening. So international trade with South Africa was put on pause. So now that even more pressure was being put on South Africa, more light was being shined on this darkness, they realized that Nelson Mandela was still in prison because of his opposition of apartheid, and this wasn't really fair. So on February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela was able to walk out of prison as a free man. 27 years of his life has passed since he was first taken to the prison, but in his own words, the long walk to freedom was almost over. So, after Nelson Mandela got out of prison, walked as a free person, after 27 years of his life in prison, in 1994, there was an election on a new South Africa. And Nelson Mandela ran, and he won. And that was the end of his story, but it also became the end of apartheid. He won at 75 years old, and his journey to freedom finally ended. And there you have it. There you have it. That's the story of, well, answering that question, basically. Talking about the protests, how a minority group was able to take over, colonize completely all of South Africa. You could see some parallels with what they did to South Africa and what they did here to the First Nations as well. Keep that in mind. Even though it was pretty hard. It wasn't that hard, but like it took a while to fully grasp it, and I always felt like I had to go further back and to understand what was actually going on. I feel like I was able to communicate it clearly, and yeah, it was cool to do research on this topic, to learn about it, learn about apartheid, and I feel like now I can talk about it more confidently because I spoke about it with you guys. So if you have any other questions, feel free to write them in the comments below. I'll do more research, answer them, and this is helping me a lot too because I'm learning stuff that I never really thought of before. I mean, in the past, I would read books like this, like Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. This was my source as well for this work, and photos from this book are really cool as well. There are a lot of symbolic photos that I like and that I would definitely put in this video, and I think I will. But yeah, these were my references, and I also got a few articles online as well. They'll all be in the comments, all be in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and as for the person who asked the question, I do hope this helped you understand how they fought back, why not those protests weren't always successful, and how they ended up being victorious in the end. Thanks so much for watching, Changemakers, and for new visitors, and I will see you guys in the next video. Probably going to be gaming, because this was a lot of work.